Chapter 851 No Holds Barred. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 7 New Gates. A flood of nightmare creatures. Thousands of tired soldiers who had hoped for a well-deserved reprieve after the long and furious battle, only to have that hope snuffed out in an instant. Sonny could feel the resolve of humans surrounding him falter, but in the end, they quickly collected themselves. The officers barked orders, the soldiers hurriedly gathered in proper formations, the lumbering mobile war platforms repositioned to open fire on the new threat. Truth be told, the new development was well within the division's ability to handle. Luckily, none of the gates showed signs of reaching Category 3, so they did not pose more threat than the previous 6. The human force had barely suffered any casualties, if any at all, in the recent battle, and they had a theoretical chance of repeating that success. If there was one problem, though, it was that the division, just like Sonny and his soldiers, had overexerted itself in the previous engagement. Logistical vehicles hastily moved forward to give the fighters an opportunity to reload their empty magazines and recharge their armor suits. Artillery needed new batches of explosive shells, infantry needed energy cells and ammunition, MWP companies needed to cool down to avoid a forced shutdown. All that demanded time, which caused humans to blunder the immensely important opening act of the second offensive. Additionally, they had lost the precious terrain advantage and strategic control due to the fact that one of the gates opened behind them. That just meant that the warriors of the awakened detachment had to pick up the slack and buy their mundane comrades a chance to regroup and properly enter the battle. That included Sonny and his soldiers, too. Damnation. Sonny remained motionless for a few moments, studying the approaching flood of nightmare creatures as his mind went into an overdrive. He had no doubt that hundreds of awakened accompanying the division would be able to stall and destroy the threat, eventually. However, this time, the human force was not going to achieve victory with minimal losses. Many people were going to die. Was it time to unleash his trump cards, already? This is just day 1, for heaven's sake. He had come to Antarctica in search of greater strength. Saving the lives of his fellow soldiers sounded very much like something that a man of conviction would do. However, Sonny was not convinced. Why should he go above and beyond to help these people to even the odds? It was not like they were going to suffer a crushing defeat. Victory was all but guaranteed, with only its cost remaining in doubt. Showing his aces, on the other hand, was a bit risky. Sonny would have felt more comfortable if he and his cohort were acting alone, but here in the middle of a massive battlefield. The thought left a bad taste in his mouth. He was tempted to bide his time. There was a grim feeling slowly rising in his heart, though. Indeed, it was the very start of a campaign that promised to be long and arduous. If Sonny did not go all out and his division lost a bunch more soldiers as a result, the losses would not be anywhere near substantial, in the grand scheme of things. However, what would happen if a bunch of soldiers died tomorrow, too, and then the day after that, and the day after that? Pretty soon, there would be no one left to fight by his side. And that was a big problem. Suddenly, a simple and chilling realization struck his mind. Sonny's eyes widened slightly. The thing he had come to understand was so straightforward that it bordered on obvious. Antarctica was not a place where one could hold back. Even though the chain of nightmares was far away from reaching its full magnitude, everyone had to exert themselves to the absolute limit already, or face eventual and inevitable destruction. In fact, even that might not be enough. Sonny gritted his teeth. He had known that this cataclysm was going to be a dreadful trial, of course, but now it became starkly clear that even Sonny had underestimated the true scope of the disaster. Theoretical understanding was very different from actual knowledge. Standing on top of the corpse of a mighty gate guardian, he sighed, and then glanced at his soldiers. That gate over there seems to be bringing our old eyeless friends to the real world. Since we already know how to handle them, it will be our next target. As one of the very few masters in the division and a captain of the first irregular company to boot, Sonny had a larger responsibility than most. It was a given that his cohort would have to lead the charge on one of the 7 gates. However, he couldn't be in several places at the same time. The gate that had opened behind the human formation, the one that posed the most threat and prevented the division from presenting a united front, thus constraining every soldier on the battlefield, was too far away from his position, and so the irregulars had no hope of reaching it in time. Someone else would have to handle it. Move out. Samara, change position to get a clear line of fire on the designated gate. Kimmy, stay close to Luster and assist him in covering the vanguard's back. Stay alive. Kill them all. Without wasting any more time, the cohort rushed forward to meet the onslaught of frenzied abominations. Hundreds of awakened joined them, creating a buffer between the nightmare creatures and the line of mundane soldiers. Buying time for the division to form an effective response. A dozen seconds after they left, however, something moved in the shadow of the massive carcass. Suddenly, a terrifying black steed emerged from it, carrying a fearsome dark rider. The rider observed the battlefield with cold indifference, and then sent her destrier into a gallop. Their eyes burned with infernal red flames. Nightmare and Saint were heading away from the approaching abominations. Toward the hastily assembled battle formation of human soldiers. Chapter 852 The Return of the Lord. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. A soldier named Ash was not having a great day. Early into the battle, his powerful exoskeleton armor suit sustained damage to one of its knee joints. Although he could still fight and shoot his rifle, not to mention more than willing to face the abominations despite having his mobility severely reduced, the command judged that the risk was not worth it. As a result, he had to abandon his fellow infantrymen and retreat to the supply train of the division, where a team of techs tried to repair his suit as fast as possible. Sadly, they weren't fast enough. Who knew that a bunch of new gates would open, with one of them appearing almost on top of the scarcely defended supply train? While the techs and other non-combatants desperately tried to retreat closer to the main formation, Ash and a small number of soldiers that happened to be nearby had no choice but to face the advancing nightmare creatures alone. They unleashed a torrent of bullets at the monsters, but there were just too many of them. Even when he emptied his shoulder-mounted launcher to send a hail of miniature rockets into the mass of rabid abominations, the surprisingly potent explosive load his missiles carried failed to make any difference. He had managed to slaughter a number of dormant bastards with that salvo, but those of them that were awakened. You needed an awakened to kill another awakened. All mundane soldiers knew that, more or less. Slowly, Ash's blood turned cold in his veins. Bad, bad, bad. An officer's shout reached his ears through the communication system of the armor suit, barely legible because of all the distortion produced by the mass of gates. Attach bayonets. Attach bayonets. That was the order that every soldier dreaded. Ash resolutely pressed a button on the side of his rifle. A moment later, a powerful alloy blade slid from underneath its barrel, turning the weapon into an improvised spear. Come then, wretches. Despite his bravado, Ash felt more and more like he was not going to live to see the next day, or whatever it was that counted as a day in the damned southern quadrant. The odds just seemed too slim. The awakened abominations were bad enough, but he at least had a theoretical chance to take down one or two with the help of his powered armor. But there were also fallen ones. Most terrifyingly of all, a creature that resembled a giant, ancient, rotting carcass of a monstrous deer had just emerged from the gate, sending the other ghastly beasts into a frenzy. It had to be a devil, at least, or maybe even a tyrant. Ash shuddered and readied himself. Well, so be it. We need to give the supply guys time to run. These bastards are going to learn what humans are capable of. Hell, who knows? Maybe reinforcements will arrive in time. In the next moment, the nightmare creatures closed in on the thin line of soldiers, making ranged fire useless. Ash caught a lunging dormant beast on the tip of his bayonet and grunted, feeling his powered armor suit being pushed back. Strong. The mini-busters on the back of the heavy exoskeleton ignited, pushing him forward. Ash sliced through the flesh of the revolting creature, then tried to land a blow on another snarling abomination. Sadly, at that moment, the damaged joint of his armor finally gave out, throwing him off balance. The bayonet slid off the hide of the awakened monster without leaving even a scratch on it. Ash helplessly toppled to the ground. Before he could move, sharp fangs closed on his shoulder, easily crushing the tempered alloy of his armor and the complicated internals of the powered suit. A terrible pain tore through his side. Die. I am going to die. He looked up and stared at the ugly snout of the monster that was going to kill him, his eyes wide. And then, the monster's head exploded into bloody chunks. Ash blinked as a visage out of a nightmare flashed past him. It was a black horse carrying a human rider that wore an intricate onyx armor. At least, the rider looked like a human. Or a demon, perhaps. It was the black steed's hoof that had crushed the nightmare creature's head. Without ever slowing down, the demonic knight continued forward, killing numerous abominations in passing. Suddenly, the pressure on the mundane soldiers reduced. The dark rider and hers nightmarish steed flew through the mass of rabid creatures, slaughtering one after another. The sword. The knight wielded a strange weapon. The sword she held was made out of black stone, and broken. Its edge, however, was still sharp. As Ash struggled to stand up, the demonic knight tore through the onslaught of nightmare creatures, getting closer and closer to the monstrous deer. At some point, the rider gracefully jumped off the black steed's back, soaring high into the air and landing right in front of the charging guardian. Ash didn't see what happened next, because the figure of the infernal knight became hidden behind the mass of nightmare creatures. All he perceived was a chilling, absolutely inhuman shriek that suddenly rolled across the battlefield, so loud that the auditory systems of his exosuit failed to filter the deafening wail out. Gods! Finally, he managed to raise himself from the ground. The battle was still not over, in fact, it was only starting. Even though Ash would have to struggle to do anything with only one functioning leg and a torn shoulder that reduced the range of motion of his right arm, he was determined to do his part. Raising his rifle once again, he glanced forward and saw the dreadful black horse rampaging among the nightmare creatures. There was no sign of its demonic rider, but judging by the erratic movements of the giant deer-like monstrosity, the Onyx Knight was fighting it. Who is crazy enough to attack that horror alone? But the mysterious warrior did not just attack the terrifying gate guardian. Ash froze for a moment. Wait, did he, no, she, did that demon actually? The rotting body of the ghastly deer suddenly swayed, and then toppled. Another shriek pierced Ash's ears, and then, the mass of nightmare creatures seemed to lose most of its coordination. The gate guardian was dead. Ash couldn't believe his luck. And, as if fortune truly smiled on him today, not too long after the fearsome abomination fell, reinforcements arrived from behind, forging an impregnable defense line to stop the enemy's advance. Ash fired the last of his bullets, then stumbled away and retreated. This time, he was sent to the field hospital instead of a repair vehicle, to have his body tended to instead of his powered suit. There, wincing as his torn shoulder was hastily mended together, Ash frowned. Wait, that armor, that demonic aura, the cold indifference and dark charisma. His eyes suddenly widened. The battle still raged on, but Ash was utterly preoccupied by something else. Eddie E.T. Was I saved, by Mongrel. Chapter 853 Bone Singer. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. This time, Sonny chose to dove into the melee from the very first moment of the battle. His bow was a fearsome tool to slay powerful targets from a distance, but now that the situation had come to a full-fledged frontal assault, restraining the horde of lesser nightmare creatures was more important. After all, they were only less than when compared to utterly terrifying abominations. Each was still a deadly threat. Plus, using the Death Dealer enchantment again was out of question. Not to mention that the value of the Dying Wish was vastly increased, considering that he was leading a good 100 of awakened instead of a single cohort right now. Any ally who could see Sunny clash with the monsters would feel inspired to fight with renewed zeal and resolve. On the other hand, he was also facing an entire horde of nightmare creatures instead of a single swarm. That meant that the dying wish would make him the target of hundreds of frenzied abominations. Its power had also increased due to the fact that he had already killed dozens of enemies affected by the Death Wish enchantment in the previous 2 battles. Oh well. He would just have to manage, somehow. Sunny had already decided to go all out, but now, for the first time in a long time, he suddenly felt a dire lack of powerful tools at his disposal. He had always prided himself on how formidable and versatile his arsenal of memories was, but it seemed to have fallen behind the kinds of threats Sunny was facing these days. He didn't even have anything to arm Saint with. To his shame, her broken stone sword was deadlier than any melee weapon he possessed, except for the cruel sight. As a part of an ascended demon, the stone blade carried the power of an ascended weapon, as well. Sadly, unlike taciturn Shadow herself, the sword had not shown any sign of being able to repair itself. Yet, Sunny was clad in the undying chain, wielded the cruel sight, and harnessed the power of the dying wish. He was also augmented by 2 of his shadows. Saint only had the broken oath, which she could not use recklessly while riding Nightmare. The Black Courser and his rider were empowered by 1 shadow each. Other than that, there was not much Sunny could employ to change the odds in his favor. Damn it, I really need more memories. What of the tools he did have, though? Kimmy, what do you see? His soldiers were his tools, too. Considering that the last powerful memory Sunny had found went to Kim, he hoped to get some results. There were just a dozen seconds left before they clashed with the enemy. The young woman lingered for a moment, and then said something that ignited a small flame in Sunny's heart. I see. These beasts are vulnerable to sonic attacks. That. Sunny had formed a similar suspicion after facing the eyeless abominations for the first time, but unsubstantiated suspicions were not something a good strategy could be built upon. Now, however, I bet it's their perception. Has to be. He summoned the flute carved out of a strange emerald femur. The Bone Singer. This ascended memory of the 3rd tier, which he had gained in the Red Colosseum, possessed 3 enchantments: Sonorous, Silenced, and Sepulchre Song. The first one allowed the flute to sing at various volumes. This was the enchantment Sunny had copied to the Silver Bell and the Ordinary Rock. The second allowed the flute to create a dome of silence around itself. The third one. Sunny had not been able to use it yet. It was supposed to raise the dead. However, one had to know how to actually play the flute to activate it, which Sunny did not. Additionally, the risen corpses would be murderous, wicked, and uncontrolled. The only way to command them and prevent them from attacking the summoner was to suit them with a correct melody, which he had no way of knowing, as well. In any case, Sunny was only interested in the Sonorous enchantment right now. Commanding the flute to sing as loud as it could, he saturated it with his essence and then threw the bone instrument to luster. Play it. The young man caught the emerald flute and stared at it with a startled expression. But, Captain, I have no idea how to. Sunny was already turning back to the tide of abominations. Just blow into the hole, damn it. Luster hesitated for half a second, then obediently brought the Bone Singer to his lips. A moment later, a deafening, discordant, ear-piercing whistle exploded from the flute, spreading far and wide. And just a moment before the flood of eyeless abominations crashed against the awakened, they suddenly stumbled and lost their momentum, as if severely disoriented. Sunny grinned as the cruel sight reaped the life of his first victim. The Bone Singer had not produced a sonic attack, per se. It was just terribly loud and hideously shrill. However, just like he had thought, that turned out to be enough. The beasts were blind, after all, they had to perceive the world through some other means, and their hearing had turned out to be the dominant one of those. If Sunny had to guess, he would have said that the long spikes on their backs were meant to sense sound waves spreading through the air, which the abominations were then able to interpret into a coherent picture of their surroundings. Subjecting them to the terrible song of the Bone Singer was akin to using a flashbang grenade. Without ever slowing down, Sunny cut into the horde of nightmare creatures. Driven into a murderous frenzy by the dying wish, hundreds of them rushed forward to tear him apart, only to die by his blade. Sunny had fully unleashed his powers. Dancing between the abominations like a dark deity, he slaughtered them without stop. Now that Sunny did not have to control the shape of the battlefield, he used shadow manifestation to enhance his own might. Dark tentacles rose from the ground to ensnare and rip his enemies apart. From time to time, 2 additional limbs appeared on his body, piercing the abominations or slicing their bodies with adamantine claws. The cruel sight shrieked like a banshee every time it cut the air. Over the years, Sunny had been subjected to all kinds of attacks and tortures. The Dark Mirror, enchantment of the Somber Spear, had long accumulated a vast library of elemental damage types. He had just never had a reason to use any except for Divine Flame and Soul attacks. Things were different now. Soon, piles of corpses and rivers of blood surrounded him. The more abominations attacked him, the more he was able to kill. The sight of the slaughter was both terrifying and eerily beautiful. The awakened detachment of the human division faced the onslaught of the nightmare creatures, shuddered, but managed to hold the horde off for a few precious minutes. Then, the mundane soldiers of the First Evacuation Army joined the fray. Supported by the destructive might of their high-tech armaments, the awakened changed their tactic and went on the offensive. Sunny led one of the charges. With his cohort serving as the tip of the spear, almost 100 warriors cut deep into the horde and moved to where the gate guardian was hiding. It was another fallen devil, similar to the one Sunny had killed a few hours before. This one, however, seemed slightly smaller, and yet more powerful. It was a female. Stay back. As the distance to the dreadful abomination grew shorter, Sunny commanded his soldiers to keep away and dove through the shadows, appearing near the gate guardian. Once again, the creature's eyelids trembled, as if about to open. Somehow, he knew that he would be in terrible danger if he ever looked into those eyes. Trusting his intuition, Sunny closed his own and dashed forward while relying entirely on shadow sense. A small lantern hanging from his belt suddenly came to life, and a flood of darkness shrouded everything around. In the embrace of shadows, Sunny suddenly felt a mortifying chill assault his senses. The defiled witness was looking at him. A moment later, a bright flash tore the darkness apart. Imbued with divine flame, the blade of the cruel sight drew a line across the abomination's neck, beheading it. As the decapitated corpse fell to its knees, the bestial head flew away, enveloped in white flames. Not long after that, the battle was finally over. Chapter 854 Perfect Alibi. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. What a day! Sunny tiredly dragged his body back to the rhino, wincing in disgust at all the bodies littering the ground. Why did nightmare creatures have to be so ugly? Why do you prefer to be surrounded by pretty corpses? That would probably be even worse. War was ugly, and maybe, just maybe, it was actually a redeeming quality. His soldiers followed him, just as exhausted. No one was seriously wounded, which was the best result Sunny could have hoped for. However, they were in no mood to speak. Other fighters of the First Army, however, felt differently. A buzz of voices surrounded them. The division was in the process of regrouping after the unexpectedly strenuous confrontation with not one, but 2 entire hordes of abominations. The logistics of the whole process were pure hell, which was only made worse by the strong interference produced by the gates. The gates, in the immediate area around the human force, separated merely by a few kilometers each. There were now 15 of them. 7 had opened at some point in the past, and 8 more opened simultaneously just a few hours ago. The idea of something like that happening would have seemed preposterous before, but with the chain of nightmares descending upon the southern quadrant, nothing was impossible anymore. Sonny shook his head. At least he collected plenty of fragments today, as well as earning himself some reputation. Anyone who had seen him fight had to be impressed. And why wouldn't they be? Sonny had personally slain 3 Gate Guardians today. There was one problem, though. As he walked through the battlefield, he couldn't help but overhear bits and pieces of various conversations. Damn, these irregulars are no joke. Have you seen their captain? The man is a demon. I heard, no, I saw him tear the head off a fallen devil's body with his bare hands. Wait, really? Although, now that I look at him, it's easy to believe. That giant guy with a sledgehammer, right? No, you idiot. The pale kid, you know, the one who looks like a haunted vintage doll. Man, who cares about some captain? Haven't you heard? Heard what? That gate behind us, do you know who cleared it? It was Mongrel. Lord Mongrel himself. No way. He's in Antarctica. Sonny blinked. What? The more he listened to what the soldiers were talking about, the more he heard the damned nickname. Mongrel, Mongrel, Mongrel. Are they all insane? Sure, Saint's armor looked somewhat similar to the mantle of the underworld, but everything else was different. Firstly, and most importantly, she was clearly a woman while he was obviously a man. Secondly, his shadow wore her closed helmet instead of Weaver's mask. Who could mistake one for another? After thinking about it for a bit, however, Sonny came to a disturbing conclusion. He knew what Weaver's mask could do and why he wore it. People, however, did not. To them, the fearsome mask was just another memory, so it was perfectly natural that Mongrel would don a helmet instead of it before going into battle. Additionally, he doubted that anyone had gotten a good look at Saint. She was moving incredibly fast while galloping to the rear of the human formation, and then dove into a mass of nightmare creatures without ever slowing down. Whatever recording remained had to be of terrible quality, considering the disrupting effect of the gates. And speaking of recordings, as soon as they reached the Rhino, Sonny connected his communicator to the vehicle's powerful communications suite and accessed the network. Almost immediately, the sensational titles of several recent articles attracted his attention. A humble hero. After eschewing the allure of fame and avoiding the limelight for almost 2 years, renowned swordsman Mongrel appears in Antarctica to save 15,000 soldiers from certain doom. Guardian angel of humanity. True to his word, Long Mongrel, who once proclaimed that he was just a human, courageously puts his life at risk to protect the human race. Exclusive footage of Lord Mongrel vanquishing a fallen tyrant. Lord Mongrel confirmed to be a lady. Sonny silently covered his face with a hand. Gods, that was fast. The government propaganda machine must have decided that Lord Mongrel, whoever he might be, was a good tool to prop up the current recruitment efforts. A somewhat hot celebrity appearing on the battlefield was a good tool to inspire more people to enlist. His face turned a little bitter. I killed 3 whole Gate Guardians, damn it. 3. Saint only killed 1, and even then, it was with the help of Nightmare. Why is no one speaking about me? Even the soldiers of his division seemed to have completely forgotten about Sonny's contributions once the news of Mongrel appearing during the battle spread. Not that Sonny wanted to be recognized for anything, in fact, he vastly preferred being a complete unknown. But still. With a sigh, he looked up the recordings uploaded to the network. Just as he had expected, the quality was terrible. Saint looked like a blurry black silhouette with no definable features. What little the government allowed to be shown did not paint a clear picture of her clash against the nightmare creatures. It just looked like a mess of movement accompanied by a litany of bestial howls. However, that only added fuel to the collective imagination of people who had watched the video. He read a few of the discussions and closed his eyes for a moment, holding back a groan. What is this crap? From what people were saying, it seemed as if mongrels single-handedly eradicated several thousands of nightmare creatures while actual soldiers helplessly stood back and applauded. Suddenly, Sonny let out a small laugh. Before unleashing Saint, he had been worried that people would connect the dots and realize that he was mongrel. Reality, however, turned out to be the exact opposite. Thousands of humans had witnessed him fight at the front of the formation, while at the same time, thousands more had seen someone who they mistakenly assumed to be mongrel fight at the back. The two couldn't possibly be the same. The action that could have potentially revealed his secret, had become a perfect alibi instead. Sonny sighed, and then shook his head in bewilderment. Well, that's something, I guess. Chapter 855 Snow and Ash. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. There were a lot of things to do before the division resumed its march. Soul shards had to be extracted from the carcasses of the nightmare creatures, the carcasses themselves had to be piled into mounds to clear the way for the vehicles. Usually, each would have been dressed to harvest useful materials. The hides and bones of the abominations were a precious resource, especially that of the fallen ones. However, no one had time to properly process the remains of the fearsome horde, so the corpses were simply discarded by the side of the road, doused in incendiary liquid, and burned. The transports and artillery vehicles, damaged war platforms, and powered suits of mechanized infantry had to be checked and repaired. Spent ammunition had to be replaced, wounded had to be healed. Soldiers, both mundane and awakened, needed time to rest and recover. Aboard the Rhino, members of the cohort slept in shifts. 3 entered the dream realm while the other 3 remained on guard. As soon as the first shift returned, the second shift took their place inside the sleeping pod. Sonny remained awake, meditating silently at the back of the vehicle. In the morning, the division had to perform one final task. In a solemn silence, the bodies of the fallen soldiers, about 100 or so, were covered by pristine white flags. The general in command of the division gave a short speech, and then lowered his head. After that, several war platforms towering above him activated powerful flamethrowers attached to their mechanical arms, unleashing long streams of furious fire to consume the bodies. In the harsh conditions of the Antarctic campaign, the First Army could not give its fallen a better burial. Even if the division could spare time to dig graves in the frozen soil, the risk of a stray nightmare creature disturbing them in the future was too high. And with so many living people waiting for their turn to board the evacuation ships, sacrificing precious space to send the bodies back home was a luxury that no one could afford. Looking at the funeral pyre in silence, Sonny couldn't help but fall into a somber mood. Although the ritual itself was beautiful and dignified, in truth, the soldiers who had sacrificed their lives were treated not much different from the nightmare creatures that had killed them. In the end, both were consumed by flames. For some reason, the image of countless candles burning in front of the academy gates appeared in his mind. With a sigh, Sonny turned away and spoke to his subordinates. "Let's go. At least the losses weren't too terrible." If Saint had not struck down the guardian of the northernmost gate so swiftly, things could have been much worse. Soon, the division moved forward. All that was left behind was a landscape decimated by the battle, with snow and ash mixing as they swirled in the air. Sonny remained at the back of the Rhino with a contemplative expression on his face. Soon, however, he was distracted from his thoughts by an incoming communication. Master Jet's alabaster face appeared on the screen. "Sonny. I have a new mission for you." The field army dispatched to the Antarctic Center had a straightforward objective: turn a small number of cities into impregnable strongholds, relocate all human population of the region to these strongholds, and then entrench themselves for as long as it was going to take to evacuate everyone. At some point, reinforcements were supposed to arrive and make the task of withstanding the siege of nightmare creatures easier. Before that happened, however, the First Army had to complete the most perilous stage of the operation alone. Siege capitals had to be built, evacuation corridors had to be established, and millions of people had to be moved through them in a timely fashion. All of that demanded the human forces to be split into numerous smaller detachments, which posed a significant risk. Additionally, there were too many moving parts to this plan, and each of them could fail and end in disaster. Right now, the division Sunny was assigned to was swiftly moving toward a large city that was going to become an entrenched stronghold. In the process, they were also laying the groundwork to establish transportation connections to smaller settlements, either by bolstering the existing civilian infrastructure or creating their own. After yesterday's battle, there seemed to be no serious obstacles in the division's path. Some of the other divisions, however, were not faring that well. Soul Reaper seemed a bit tired as she spoke from the screen. Got a bit of a problem. There is a Category 3 gate blocking their way, guarded by a powerful corrupted creature. From the initial observation, it is at least a devil, however, it could also be a tyrant. Winter can't handle it alone. You and I are the closest, so, buckle up. Separate from your division and move south-east at full speed until you reach the rendezvous point. It's about 70 kilometers away from your current position. Sunny briefly studied the map, then said hesitantly. A corrupted tyrant, are you sure that the three of us can manage killing it? All corrupted abominations were frightening, but a tyrant, the thought of facing one in battle made Sunny feel ill at ease. He had only ever fought one creature of that rank, the Wormvine. Even then, he had only killed the vile monster by slaying its host with the Ader's wooden knife. Of course, Sunny had been a mere awakened back then. He was much more powerful now. But, what truly disturbed him was the lack of information. Fighting an enemy after studying it for a while was completely different from going in blind. He probably had a slim chance against a corrupted tyrant if there was ample time to prepare. As it stood, though, Master Jet did not seem to share his concerns. She grinned darkly, and then shook her head. The three of us is enough. However, this time, we won't be fighting alone. Someone else will be joining the fun. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Who? Soul Reaper leaned forward a little. A saint. Chapter 856 Alien Landscape. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The first evacuation army was accompanied by 3 saints. One was loyal to the government, while the other two had been sent by the great clans. Unofficially, Valor and Song had refused to participate in the Southern Quadrant campaign. Officially, however, they still had to keep up appearances. For that reason, each had provided a token force to support the evacuation effort, and the 2 saints in question were in charge of these forces. Sunny did not know who these transcendent were. All he knew was that the government had wisely chosen to separate them, sending one to East Antarctica, while the other ended up in the Antarctic Center. And now, apparently, that latter was coming to aid the irregulars in vanquishing a powerful corrupted abomination. He was not sure how to feel about that. On one hand, the help of a saint was more than welcomed. On the other hand, one of the reasons he had decided to participate in the Antarctica campaign was to get away from the great clans and their machinations. Now, it seemed that he just couldn't escape coming in contact with the sovereigns and their forces. Curse it all. With a sigh, Sunny sent Luster the coordinates of the rendezvous point and walked over to the pilot's cabin. We have new orders. Get to this location as fast as possible. The young man yawned, studied the coordinates for a bit, and then nodded. Aye, sir. He lingered for a moment. By the way, what's there? Sunny shrugged with a nonchalant expression. A corrupted tyrant. Something like that. Luster paled, stared at him with wide eyes, and suddenly grew very quiet. Rhino left the marching formation of the division and accelerated forward, quickly overtaking slower vehicles. Then, it made a sharp turn, left the wide highway entirely, and entered uneven terrain. Its massive wheels easily rolled through mud and rocks. Thanks to the high-tech suspension system, the members of the cohort barely felt any disturbance. In the next several hours, the armored vehicle briskly traversed the wild expanse of the Antarctic center. Powerful spotlights installed on the Rhino's roof flooded the landscape in front of it with stark light, cutting the dimness with wide beams. Various sensors supplied Luster with additional information to better steer the heavy carrier. The Antarctic center was very different from the wilderness of Asia that Sonny had seen during his brief train ride. It was just as lifeless, but in a different manner. There were fewer signs of past wars and disasters here, but at the same time, the land somehow seemed even more desolate. It was much more uneven and mountainous, too. Basically, most of the landmass was covered by a vast mountain chain. Because of that, the horizon was obscured most of the time, and it was hard to notice any approaching threats. More than that, the landscape itself looked strange and alien. Well, no surprise. After all, Antarctica had been covered by ice for millions of years, and only recently shrugged off its heavy veil. The passing of monumental glaciers had left many strange things behind. The Rhino was doing an amazing job of navigating the complicated terrain. It moved toward the rendezvous point with sufficient speed, sometimes making use of existing roads, sometimes cutting through untouched wilderness. It climbed or descended tall hills and mountain outcroppings, traversed stretches of frozen marshlands, and waded through labyrinths of giant boulders with equal ease. If there was one thing that kept Sonny tense, it was that he rarely had an opportunity to see far ahead. These days, the southern quadrant was not as lifeless as it had used to be. The life that was spreading through its reaches, however, was not the kind anyone in the waking world would welcome. Eventually, he sighed and climbed on the Rhino's roof through one of the upper hatches. Since Samara was yet to return from the dream realm, Sonny was the only member of the cohort with decent means of ranged attack. Using the open lid of the hatch to shield himself from the cold winds, Sonny summoned Morgan's warbow and peered into the dimness that surrounded the moving vehicle. In the next few hours, he had to use his bow 3 times. Several stray abominations wandered into the Rhino's path, only to be slain by a swift black arrow before having the chance to approach it. Luckily, none of them turned out to be too powerful or laid a dangerous ambush. For now. By noon, which, of course, looked the same as morning, evening, and night, the Rhino reached the ruins of a small outpost, where 2 similar carriers were parked in the shadow of a broken wall. A handful of people could be seen gathered around a fire, having a cozy meal. As Luster stopped the vehicle, Sonny jumped off the roof and walked toward the fire. Orange light gleamed, reflecting from the bleak metal of his armor. "What are you guys drinking?" The members of Queen's and Soul Reaper's cohort looked at him with wistful expressions. "That, just hot water, sir. The cargo capacity of our carriers is limited, so we couldn't bring anything better." He shook his head, then summoned the covetous coffer. As the large chest manifested itself into reality and opened its toothy maw, Sonny thrust his hand inside, and then threw a can of instant coffee and an expensive chocolate bar to the startled awakened. "Oh, sir. Thank you, sir." The bunch of irregulars did not look like people who were about to fight a corrupted abomination of a high class. They seemed relaxed and nonchalant about the whole ordeal, and paid more attention to the can of coffee than to a menacing mountain that loomed above them. The Category 3 gate was situated on its peak. As the grateful awakened brewed coffee for themselves and Sonny's soldiers, who emerged from the Rhino and joined them, he looked around and noticed Master Jet and Winter. The 2 were standing some distance away, discussing something between themselves in low voices. He headed toward them and caught the tail end of their conversation. "Dot is definitely a woman. Hot as hell, too. I am telling you, idiot, I saw that mongrel guy myself once. He's definitely a man. Everyone knows that you're blind in both eyes when it comes to these things, Reaper. I mean, remember the time when that handsome saint tried to hit on you?" "What are you talking about?" "He was just hoping to cooperate with us to claim a new citadel, damn. You are hopeless, you know that. All men." At that moment, Sonny approached them, glanced at Master Jet, and then cleared his throat. Winter stared at him for a moment. See? Case in point. What is that supposed to mean? As Sunny pondered what she alluded to, Master Jet smiled and waved at him. Ah, Sunny. You're just on time. The saint should be arriving any moment now, too. He couldn't help but frown. Who, exactly, is? At that moment, a vaguely familiar feeling suddenly overwhelmed him. Sunny sensed a massive shadow covering the ruined outpost, and then heard a sound that resembled the rustle of 1,000 wings. Suddenly, a fourth figure was standing among them. Sunny blinked, momentarily lost for words. Saint Tyrus. What are you doing here? In front of his stood none other than Sky Tide of the White Feather Clan. Chapter 857 Jade Beetle. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The woman standing in front of Sunny was tall and slender, with long hair that fell down in a gentle cascade of pale gold. Her posture was perfectly straight, and her cold face was dazzlingly beautiful. Sky Tide was wearing a suit of light steel armor, with pauldrons and greaves decorated with stylized feathers. The gaze of her stern amber eyes was piercing and heavy, while her strange vertical pupils resembled that of a bird of prey. Snowflakes swirled and danced in the air, as if trying to get closer to her. Sunny was rather startled to see the familiar transcendent. Saint Tyrus. What are you doing here? Sky Tide glanced at him, Master Sunless. It is good to see you again. I am glad to find you in good health. As for why I am here, isn't it obvious? I have come to hunt the beast. He shifted awkwardly. No, I meant why are you here, in Antarctica? She stared at him expressionlessly. White Feather Clan has been tasked with supporting the evacuation effort in the southern quadrant. Oh. Suddenly, a few things clicked into place. Back when Sky Tide had killed Saint Cormac to protect Sunny and Cassie, she told them that she would be punished by the great clan Valor. She had also told them that they would not dare to penalize her too severely. It seemed that having the Chained Isles taken away was not enough of a punishment for the willful saint. Valor had to make a gesture by sending a token force to Antarctica, and so, the White Feather Clan had drawn the short straw. It seemed that they had lost their idyllic domain and were banished to the cold reaches of the war-torn continent, at least for the time being. Looking around, Sunny suppressed a sad sigh. The dark and inhospitable land surrounding them was a far cry from the Empyrean beauty of the sanctuary of Noctis. He felt a bit guilty about the whole thing. Sky Tide did not seem to mind, though. Or at least hid her displeasure perfectly. Master Jet, meanwhile, looked at them with curiosity. Ah. I have forgotten that the two of you know each other. In any case, we are grateful for your assistance, Saint Tyrus. Sky Tide simply nodded. Soon, the gaze of her striking amber eyes drifted to the tall mountain looming above the ruined outpost. What do we know about the enemy? Soul Reaper shook her head slightly. Not much. Then, she smiled and looked at the youngest member of the group. Yet Sunny, do your thing, do your thing. Do your thing. What kind of request is that? As Sunny grumbled silently, his shadows nimbly scaled the slopes of the mountain. By now, the range of shadow control had exceeded 12 kilometers, so it was not impossible for them to reach the peak. There was hardly anyone better suited to spy on the corrupted abomination. However, Sunny grimaced as the call of the nightmare assaulted his mind. Now that he was observing a Category 3 gate, its subtle influence grew much stronger and harder to ignore. There was a wide crack that had almost split the peak of the mountain in two. The dark rift of the gate pulsed inside the cavernous schism, and there was stone debris littering the immediate area around it. Many shards had rolled down the steep slopes, while a few giant boulders had even reached all the way down, smashing large parts of the outpost the irregulars were currently hiding in and decimating the road that led to it. Strangely, he did not notice the nightmare creatures immediately. It was only after the creepy shadow, true to its name, crept closer that a sudden shiver ran through his body. Sunny noticed hundreds of shapes resting between the rocks. The abominations were easy to miss because their carapaces were as white as the snow covering the top of the mountain, and had a texture that resembled rock. They looked like giant insects that were as large as adult humans. Some of them were awakened, some were fallen, and a few larger ones were even corrupted. None of them could compare to the enormous abomination hiding in the shadow of the shattered peak, however. With its smooth milky white chitin and unmoving black eyes, the jade creature resembled an oversized, appalling, monstrous beetle. It was easily 3 times the size of the rhino, with 6 mighty legs and terrifying mandibles that seemed powerful enough to crush heavily armored war platforms. Looking at the motionless abomination, Sunny suddenly felt an eerie sense of foreboding. He glanced at Saint Tyrus, Master Jet, and Winter with a dark expression. It's a tyrant, all right. Large, thick armor. Resembles an insect. There are around 500 drones under its command, many of them fallen. I've noticed at least 24 corrupted lieutenants, as well. He lingered for a moment, and then called out. Kimmy. The seer of his cohort activated her aspect ability, allowing him to see the swarm of stone beetles in a new light. Studying their tough carapaces, Sunny slowly listed a few vulnerable points. Then shifted his gaze to the tyrant. Unlike its minions, the giant white beetle did not seem to possess any pronounced weak spots. Sunny did not know whether the armor of the powerful creature was that good or whether Kim simply could not peer through the defenses of an enemy that outranked and outclassed her so much, but the result was the same. Killing the tyrant was not going to be easy. He shared what little information he had been able to gather and glanced at the other officers with doubt. So, what do we do now? Saint Tyrus remained silent, but Master Jet smiled. Her smile was dark and vicious. What else? We kill it. Sunny blinked. How? Soul Reaper waited for a few moments, then looked at Sky Tide. The Transcendent crossed her arms. I will handle the tyrant. As long as it's bound to the ground, I can attack the creature with impunity. If 1 attack doesn't crack its shell, 10 will. If 10 attacks fail, 100 will do the job. She looked at the irregulars and frowned. However, you will have to deal with its retinue. That task is not going to be easy. Winter snorted, and then suddenly laughed. Easy. What's that? Chapter 858 Aerial Superiority. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. They did not spend too much time trying to come up with a detailed plan. Firstly, because the nightmare creatures could have discovered the irregulars at any moment. Secondly, because no plan they could come up with would have been reliable. There was just too little information at their disposal. Without knowing what the tyrant, the few devils serving it, and the lesser soldiers of the Stone Hive were capable of, what was the point of creating rigid strategies? The battle ahead was going to be decided by raw power, resolve, and ability to swiftly adapt to changing circumstances. Luckily, the irregulars had more than enough power at their disposal. With 3 elite masters and an actual saint leading them, there was hardly a more fearsome human force in the Antarctic Center. Would that power be enough, though? They were going to find out soon. How did I end up here? Creeping up the slope of the mountain with a morose expression, Sunny bitterly remembered his dreams of becoming a rich, decadent, cowardly shop owner. What was he doing on a continent drowning in nightmare gates, preparing to battle a corrupted tyrant and its army? He could have been relaxing in the hot springs of a luxurious spa with a bunch of beauties right now. That was what rich people did, right? Instead, Sunny hid behind a tall boulder, shivered in the cold, and glanced at the handful of people pressing against rocks around him. Sure, there were plenty of beauties among them, as well. But it wasn't the same. It couldn't be more different, really. Damn. There was still a good stretch of the mountain slope remaining until the peak. That high, the air was not devoid of oxygen yet, but it surely tasted different. None of the awakened would be hindered by the slight hypoxia or suffer from the high-altitude illness, of course, but it still required some adjustment. Sunny sighed and watched as St. Tyrus calmly walked forward. A swarm of sparks surrounded her hand, and then coalesced into a long javelin. At the same time, Winter summoned a strange silver bow and 2 arrows. She knocked one on the string of the bow and waited. A shadow hiding at the peak of the mountain watched as one of the hideous insects wandered to the edge of a protruding rock outcropping and froze, its long antennae twitching in the wind. Sunny frowned. I think we're noticed." Before he could warn anyone, however, Sky Tide took one last step, raised her javelin, and silently threw it into the dark sky. Her throw caused the snow around St. Tyrus to be cleared away by the gale of crushing wind. The rocks beneath her feet cracked. In the next moment, a thunderous roar of a sonic boom rolled across the mountains as the javelin accelerated toward the peak with terrifying speed. It streaked across the sky like a radiant star, and then collided against the tyrant's carapace with devastating force. The milky white chitin did not shatter, though. The javelin shattered instead. As St. Tyrus tilted her head a little, Winter shot an arrow almost straight up. It flew into the sky and then exploded with brilliant radiance, flooding the gloomy slope with bright light. Illuminated by it, the nightmare creatures hiding behind the rocks moved. They ran forward with surprising agility and then jumped, twisting their bodies into tight spheres. Hundreds of these spheres then rolled down, approaching the hiding irregulars like with terrible speed. Sunny felt his heart growing heavy. Because of how similar the carapaces of the stone hive soldiers were to actual rock, it seemed as if the mountain itself was falling on them. And that wasn't all. The tyrant moved forward and opened its maw, disgorging a cloud of darkness from it. The cloud flowed down like an avalanche of volcanic ash, swallowing the figures of rolling drones as it overtook them. Sunny did not know what the black avalanche consisted of, but his intuition was screaming that inhaling, or even being touched by the black ash was deadly to humans. At that moment, Sky Tide suddenly disappeared, and a massive shape shot forward from their formation. A giant bird of prey with white feathers and talons forged of lustrous steel appeared above the mountain, gaining speed as it flew into the sky. Her body was wreathed in a radiant mantle of dancing lightning bolts. As St. Tyrus moved her enormous wings, the cloud of black ash was torn apart by the hurricane winds and dissipated long before reaching the irregulars. She soared high into the dim sky and then plummeted down, aiming to savage the jade beetle with her terrifying beak. The two monstrous creatures collided, and the tyrant jumped back with an ear-piercing screech. A beam of darkness escaped from its maw, but Sky Tide was already rising into the sky as she circled to deliver another devastating attack. The bolts of lightning gathered on her body and then shot forward, colliding with the dark beam. It seemed to weaken considerably and missed the swift saint, disappearing into the somber expanse of cold heavens. A net of lightning descended from above and bit into the milky white jade chitin of the tyrant. A devastating thunderclap battered it like a physical attack. Tyrus folded her wings and fell down again, leaving deep grooves on the enemy's armor with her talons. The whole mountain shook from the ferocious force of their clash. Comparatively uninjured, but hopelessly outmatched by the flying opponent, the jade beetle seemed almost aggrieved. Its black eyes stared at the silhouette of the colossal bird with an indescribable, inhuman emotion. And then, the tyrant straightened. Its carapace suddenly seemed to split in the middle and move aside like a giant gate. From beneath it, for long, translucent wings emerged and then blurred, causing the massive creature to rise into the air. It would have been an eerily beautiful image, if it wasn't so dreadful. Looking from below, Sunny gritted his teeth. Well. Crap. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 859 Summit. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The corrupted tyrant and Sky Tide were of the same rank, but there was an abyss of 4 entire classes separating them. Nevertheless, Saint Tyrus had been confident in her ability of defeating the perverse creature. NV. As long as it was bound to the ground. That was what she had told them. Watching the giant insect spread its 4 translucent wings and soar into the somber sky, both grotesque and eerily beautiful at the same time. Sunny froze for a moment. Then, he looked back down. Nothing ever went according to plan. That was just the reality of things, and the irregulars had been prepared to face unforeseen circumstances from the very start. Saint Tyrus was going to have to manage, somehow, on her own. The rest of them had their own trial to face. He couldn't spare attention to the titanic battle happening above. Hundreds of nightmare creatures were bearing down upon the 3 cohorts of irregulars like an avalanche. Contracted into balls of white chitin, the soldiers of the stone hive were rolling down the mountain slope with tremendous speed, all their vulnerable spots safely protected. Their advance could be easily seen in the light of winter's radiant arrow. Among them were awakened, fallen, and even corrupted abominations. Beasts, monsters, demons, and even devils. The air this close to the summit of the mountain was cold and thin, and unlike the previous battle, humans held an unfavorable position below the enemy. Worse still, Sunny had yet to recover from yesterday's exertion. He had barely half of his essence left. Saint and Nightmare were mending themselves in the dark flames of his soul after the clash with the powerful Gate Guardian. Things weren't looking good. Whatever. More fragments for me. As he thought that, Winter sent a second arrow into the sky. It disappeared into the darkness and then seemed to explode into 1,000 brilliant shards. Her aspect was a strange one. From what Sunny knew, it combined some sort of powerful combat augmentation with an affinity to revelation. Winter was both a warrior and a seer. As a result, she never missed. That was not an exaggeration, just a frightening and bizarre fact. She had literally never missed a shot since becoming an awakened. It did not matter what weapon Winter used, be it a bow, a sling, a throwing dagger, or simply a rock. They always struck true. Of course, simply being able to hit the target did not always mean victory. What made her truly formidable was an extensive arsenal of enchanted arrows that she had accumulated over the years. Master Winter was basically a walking artillery unit. As the 1,000 brilliant shards rained from the sky, each revealed itself to look like a small silver arrow. They bit into the mass of rolling abominations, shredding their carapaces and finding their way through the smallest cracks in the chitin armor. Instantly, fetid blue lymph flowed onto the snow-covered rocks. A moment later, another arrow was already knocked on the string of Winter's bow, with several more already manifesting themselves from a whirlwind of sparks. Each appeared exactly as the previous one was sent flying. Shooting the bow with unnatural speed, she unleashed a squall of death on the mass of descending nightmare creatures. Every arrow was unique, but absolutely deadly. Studying the nimble, calculated, and lethal movements of the older master, Sunny couldn't help but sigh. So that's what a professional looks like. He had a long way to go if he hoped to reach this realm of archery. Soon, the other ranged fighters among the irregulars joined the fray. Almost all members of Winter's own cohort were sharpshooters of some kind, so it easily outshone the rest in this phase of the battle, reaping dozens of abominable lives. Often, the awakened marksman aimed at the breaches in the white carapaces that the rain of arrows summoned by Winter had created. As blue runes ignited on the silver limbs of her bow, she grinned. Show them hell. Whoever kills the most gets a hug, The information about the weak spots of the Stone Hive soldiers that Kim and Sunny had provided also helped. Soon, he heard a familiar electric whine and saw a powerful explosion bloom among the abominations, ripping a few of them apart. Samara was adding her prodigal firepower to the deadly onslaught of the ranged specialists. Sunny, however, restrained himself from using a bow. In this battle, he needed to conserve his essence as much as possible. Plus, he was meant to play a different role. The tide of abominations was almost upon them. Sunny. He turned around and saw Master Jet running at him. Her short raven black hair was dancing in the wind, and her eyes were burning with chilling blue light. There was a light armor of black leather wrapped tightly around her body, and a familiar dark glaive trailing behind her. Lowering himself slightly, he interlocked his fingers and offered his hands to her as a step. As soon as Soul Reaper's foot landed in this cradle, he strained his muscles and threw her into the air. Augmented by 3 shadows, his strength was nothing short of monstrous. Boosted by Sunny, Jet flew forward as if she was an arrow herself. The somber glaive flashed, cutting. No, passing through the body of one of the corrupted abominations before it could even react. The creature rolled forward with tremendous speed for a few more moments, but then suddenly convulsed, unfurled its massive body, and came to a shuddering stop. Its white carapace was perfectly whole, with not even a smallest crack on it. And yet, the massive beast was dead. As Soul Reaper slid on the icy rocks, hundreds of abominations attacked the line of irregulars and the swift human who had managed to kill one of their leaders. The massive balls of white chitin instantly unfurled into terrifying insect-like abominations and lunged at their victims, their sharp mandibles clicking and their segmented legs scraping against the stones. Master Jet was already moving, dodging numerous attacks as she dashed toward the next corrupted target. Looking at her, Sunny blinked. Fast. Then, he had no more time to think. Chapter 860 Stone Hive. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Even though the archers managed to kill and wound a lot of nightmare creatures, there were still enough of them left to bury the irregulars under a mass of chitinous bodies. Master Jet's sudden advance divided their attention and lessened the pressure on the rest of the human force, but that was not her primary goal. In this battle, Soul Reaper was tasked with the most important objective: eliminating the corrupted abominations that threatened to wipe out the awakened soldiers. Awakened were supposed to fight nightmare creatures of their own rank. Facing a fallen abomination was usually a recipe for disaster, and only a small amount of human warriors could be confident in defeating an overbearing foe like that. Killing a creature of a higher rank was a rare enough accomplishment that it could substantially change one's reputation. Still, it was not impossible. Sunny himself, as well as every other survivor of the Forgotten Shore, had slain plenty of beings that they had no business fighting. That was what made them so abnormal. In the terrible crucible of the Forgotten Shore, only the strongest of the strongest survived. Of course, there were plenty of equal talents among the rest of the awakened, and the elites chosen to become irregulars were among them. But they stood no chance against the corrupted. The power gap of 2 ranks was just too insurmountable. In the rarest of circumstances, a victory could still be possible. But usually, awakened would not even be able to leave a scratch on the bodies of these monsters. No conventional weapon could harm them either. That was why the corrupted lieutenants of the Stone Hive had to die first. Considering that these revolting insects possessed immensely durable armor, Soul Reaper had been chosen to strike them down. Her dreadful aspect, after all, allowed her to ignore all forms of physical protection. That did not mean that the rest of the irregulars were going to get it easy. Even without the strongest abominations, the rest of the hive was more than capable of tearing the few humans apart. Unless humans destroyed them first. This time, the terrain they had to fight on did not give the irregulars any advantages. They could not create a layered formation where melee fighters held the enemies off in the front while the archers pelted them with arrows from the back. The small human force was destined to be instantly surrounded. That was where Sunny came in. Most of the irregulars created a defensive line slightly higher up the slope, while the ranged specialists continued to shoot arrows and other projectiles over their heads. Their line bent like a crescent moon so that the abominations could not attack them from the sides. He alone stood behind the formation, holding the cruel sight and breathing deeply. Sunny's task was simple. To not let even a single nightmare creature attack the human force from the back. Let's go. The tide of Stone Hive soldiers broke against the single blade of Soul Reaper's glaive, collided against the defensive line of irregulars, and spilled over it. He saw a mass of abominations slide past him from the sides, slow down, then turn around and scurry back up the slope. His fourth shadow had just returned and wrapped itself around the blade of the cruel sight, and at the same time, the dying wish called the enemy's fourth. Sunny dashed forward with stunning speed. At the same time, the shadows around him seethed, and then exploded forward with 4 long and powerful tentacles. Each tentacle pierced the carapace of a nightmarish insect and tore its body apart. A moment later, the cruel sight shone with furious white light and slid into a thin crack between the thorax and the head of a fallen abomination, turning its soft innards and brain into ash. Sunny twisted his spear, decapitating the appalling creature. To his surprise, even without its head, the insect continued forward, trying to skewer him with 2 of its long, segmented legs. With a startled snarl, Sunny crashed into it with his shoulder and sent the heavy monster flying back like a cannonball. At the same time, his shadow tentacles twisted and shot forward, breaking the legs of several more abominations. Bastards! Do you really think you can touch me? Pathetic bugs like you. Can. Never hope to kill a noble cockroach like me. Suddenly, a mad smile appeared on his face, grinning like a lunatic. Sunny spun in the growing tide of Stone Hive soldiers, killing them one after another. After the Red Colosseum, it was not hard for him to shadow nightmare creatures. Even though bestial abominations like these did not possess sentience, let alone refined battle techniques, they still had unique instincts, behavioral patterns, and character. As such, he could mirror and predict their attacks just as well as that of humans. In fact, it was much easier but also much harder. It was not difficult to peer into the essence of their ferocious combat instincts and adopt them, but doing so put him in terrible peril. It was hard to not lose himself. It was hard to remain human. Luckily, there was an anchor that held that which made Sunny a person together. His true name, Lost from Light. With its help, he could always return from the formless depths of Shadow Dance, no matter how far he dove into its strange embrace. Stone-like chitin cracked and shattered. Blow lymph shot into the air. Broken mandibles and segmented limbs rolled away, severed by the ruthless blade of the cruel sight. For now, Sunny managed to prevent any nightmare creatures from getting past him. Most fell into a murderous frenzy because of the dying wish and aimed to kill him and no one else, and the few that managed to shrug the effect off were dragged back and killed by the long and malleable shadow tentacles. There were more and more abominations attacking him, though. And among them, much more powerful creatures suddenly appeared. An ominous feeling brushed against Sunny's mind. What the hell? He could have sworn that an especially large insect had been barreling toward him just a moment ago. For tumorous growths of darkness within its body revealed that the giant abomination was a fallen devil. But now, it was gone. Where is it? Before Sunny could find an answer, the mountain slope beneath his feet suddenly split open, and from it, a hungry maw appeared, too close and swift for him to escape.